Well, hello there, and welcome to another episode of the Quadruple D. And today we're going to be talking about how Keir Starmer and US media are currently selling the US UK trade deal. So, to be blunt, practically any trade deal with the United States right now is, it's going to be a mixed bag at best, to say the least. So, in this episode, I'm kind of going to be raining on the parade a little bit. So, despite mounting global condemnation of the United States for its support of Israel's military campaign in Gaza, widely characterized as genocidal by legal scholars, human rights groups, and the International Criminal Court, the UK government under Prime Minister Keir Starmer has chosen to deepen its ties with the US through a new trade agreement that the media is going to portray in positive terms, at least for the most part, from what I have seen so far. The decision comes as evidence accumulates of the US enabling large scale civilian killings in Gaza via military aid, while also perpetuating human rights violations domestically through its Immigration and Customs Enforcement or ICE agency. And this kind of thing matters, like what why is the media going to be more interested in promoting this trade deal than in criticizing the certain behaviors that are going on? And rather than reassessing the so called special relationship with Washington in light of these atrocities, Starmer has aggressively pursued closer economic alignment. In February, he presented Donald Trump with a personal letter from King Charles III. Well, isn't that nice? Aw. It just warms your heart, doesn't it? But it was a letter inviting the former, well, I keep wanting to call him former, he's current president, for a second state visit. Starmer has continued to court Trump directly, even discussing personal matters such as Trump's Turnberry Golf Club in Scotland. I almost pronounce it like Scotland. So maybe the UK accent is starting to come in, so I can more properly relate this article's information. But anyway, this diplomatic groveling, which is basically what it is, culminated in an agreement touted as full and comprehensive, with both leaders declaring it a milestone for transatlantic cooperation. And keep in mind, transatlantic cooperation is what's supposed to be happening anyway. So, to treat something normal as if it's some huge win, it's a little bit misleading at best, right? So again, I'm raining on the parade a little bit. So get your umbrellas out because it's going to be stormy in this episode. But the political theater really it masks a deeper ethical void here. The United States continues to arm Israel as it lays siege to Gaza, where over 100,000 Palestinians have been killed, many of them children, according to Gaza's health ministry and, of course, other organizations that have investigated it, the Lancet Medical Journal, and the the media that has actually tried to have a more factual accounting of what's going on there. And of course, the government of Israel has openly admitted to a policy of deliberate starvation of the population, and Trump has basically promoted the idea of taking over the territory and doing a full ethnic cleansing of the area. They're not really hiding anything here. So the idea that, accusing them of genocide is just some sort of left-wing hysteria, well, it's a little bit ridiculous because they're admitting everything. So, international law experts, including those at the UN and the ICJ, have warned that the campaign meets the threshold for genocide under the Genocide Convention. Despite this, Washington has blocked or vetoed ceasefire resolutions at the UN and doubled down on military aid. And Britain, instead of distancing itself from such complicity, has aligned even more tightly with its transatlantic partner in crime. So, at the same time, within its own borders, the US continues to operate a brutal immigration regime. ICE has been repeatedly accused of violating due process and human rights. Cases like that of Kilmar Abrego Garcia, an asylum seeker who has been kidnapped by ICE and currently resides in El Salvador after being uh, sent to their prison for actually not committing any crime because he has not been convicted of anything. And he was here legally, he was abiding by all the laws, he was regularly, checking in with ICE itself and abiding by everything the way he was supposed to, but they still shipped him off. So, yeah, as Trump falsely claims he is an MS-13 gang member, and El Salvador's president, Bukele, even falsely claimed Abrego Garcia is a terrorist. So Bukele plainly gave the game away on that one. Claiming the man was a terrorist is making the smear target more cartoonishly evil. It's like it gives the game away. It reveals that they're just trying to smear him without any regard to evidence. Just call him a terrorist. Well, what terrorist act has he committed? Zero. They have done nothing to prove that he committed any terrorist act. I almost said the word promote there, because I was going to say promote the idea that he is a terrorist. They have provided no facts that actually successfully verify any such claim. When they haven't lied and claimed he was a terrorist, they have also lied and suggested he should be in prison for life because of tattoos he has. And Trump repeatedly falsely claimed in a recent interview that there were MS-13 tattoos on his hands, and therefore, oops, he deserves to be sentenced for life. So now, if you got offensive tattoos on your hands or presumably anywhere else on your body, well, that's a life sentence. I guess that's something that we learn uh, in school. If you got a certain tattoo, you have no rights anymore. There's a clear, basically life sentence in store for you if you have a tattoo that the U.S. government doesn't like. Now, that's a little bit of news. How come I didn't learn that in civics class? It's a new piece of information for me, but maybe I just fell asleep in the middle of class or something. But they also claim he deserves life in prison based on how he wore his hat. So yeah, you gotta not have a tattoo on your hand that the government doesn't like, or a hat. You can't wear a certain style of hat, or wear your hat in a certain way that they think is bad. And you know, they also cite a minor legal incident where his wife had sort of like a restraining order against him. So apparently, if you had a minor domestic dispute that had the cops called and there was a protective order or something like that, well, you deserve a life sentence. Wow. But lots of news here. Uh, you know what I mean? So that's all interesting. And despite some good coverage on the topic, the media have routinely failed to emphasize a simple fact that in America you don't get a life sentence for having a tattoo or wearing your hat in a certain way. And you also are supposed to receive due process if you are a person residing in this country. It doesn't matter if you're not a U.S. citizen, you're supposed to have due process. It's a fact that that's what the U.S. Constitution says. You can look it up yourself. Anything that shies away from that is systemic abuse. And of course, here's the real kicker. Even if you're one of those types who says, "Oh, due process," the immigrants don't deserve that. Well, how do you prove somebody is an immigrant or not without due process? You can't. So even to verify a person's legal status, what they're designated as, requires some sort of process like that. Otherwise, you're just taking the government at their word, and that sort of thing. So, anyway, ICE has violated the constitutional rights of detained immigrants by indefinitely detaining them, and in some cases shipping them out of the country, like what I just discussed, and that can increasingly happen without judicial review. So, in a highly publicized case that's fairly recent, 3 U.S. citizen children, including one with cancer, were deported from Louisiana to Honduras with their undocumented mothers. The children aged 2, 4, and 7 were deported within 24 hours of being detained with little to no access to legal counsel. The 4-year-old, suffering from metastatic cancer, was taken without access to this medication. So, yeah, that's a sort of development that's happening here. The agency's practices have included forced sterilization, which is not mentioned often enough. ICE forcibly sterilized some people at a for profit ICE detention center at the Irwin County Detention Center in Georgia. So there have been inhumane conditions aside from that, and family separation. These are practices which have been condemned by human rights observers and legal advocacy organizations, such as the ACLU. And they did a report on the immigration detention and coerced sterilization story. And they noted that a whistleblower who was a nurse there described multiple forms of medical abuse, from failures to protect patients against COVID-19 to forced hysterectomies. So that's happening. The US government's contract with the detention center was terminated, but don't think for a second that these ICE Nazis won't try to implement something similar, assuming they haven't done something similar already. And ironically, this war against so called invading immigrants who are supposedly all murderers and rapists and terrorists, it happens while the US has repeatedly threatened to invade its own allies, whether it's Mexico, Greenland, and even Canada. Uh, if you remember, Trump even referred to the Canada US border as an artificially drawn line. Well, wait a second. How come the United States can disregard other people's borders, but other people can't disregard our borders? That's a little bit strange as a double standard. The United States can implement actual coups overseas, support dictatorships and terrorist groups, and somehow that's fine. But if somebody just comes here, seeking employment, then they're likened to a terrorist or something. Or if they're seeking political asylum, they're a demon, basically. So that Britain would choose to strengthen ties with such a regime should be cause for public outcry to some extent, right? But instead, mainstream media and political discourse framed the new trade deal as a diplomatic win, even though, of course, like I said, it's simply how things should normally function anyway. So to treat it like it's some sort of revelation that that a deal was struck or something. It's misleading, and of course it's overlooking these other scandals to sort of normalize what's happening here. Anyway, the agreement reportedly includes reduced U.S. tariffs on British car exports, relaxed barriers to steel and aluminum, and increased access for American beef and ethanol, while the UK avoids importing controversial products like chlorinated chicken. There's even a new technology partnership focused on AI and bioengineering, raising red flags about surveillance and data exploitation. So, it's a pretty far-ranging deal as far as we know so far. Though the economic framing emphasizes mutual benefit, the underlying reality is that these deals overwhelmingly serve multinational corporations. And, I hate to rain on your parade again, but that's always going to be the case with these types of leaders. They're going to emphasize the multinational corporations, and it will, in many ways, be at the expense of the general population. So Boeing will reportedly gain $10 billion dollars in aircraft sales, while U.S. agribusiness giants access a large slice of the UK market. The deal also opens U.S. markets to $5 billion dollars worth of American agricultural exports. Meanwhile, British farmers and workers may face competition from deregulated American products. Keep in mind, we are cutting a huge chunk of our health and safety regulations under Trump, so all of this is done without any meaningful public input or democratic process. This is a, a major loss in some ways because this is all happening with sweeping deregulation. So the health and safety standards are being gutted, and the trade deal is still being promoted as if it's a major win, when in fact it's really a normalization of major losses for the working class and consumers, because the products that are hitting the global market, at least some of them, well, many of them most likely, are going to be less regulated and therefore less safe. And if you want evidence of that, just look at the Cybertruck and all of the reports about all the problems with that. And of course, Elon Musk, who was promoting the Cybertruck, he was largely in charge of the effort to sort of wreck the federal government. All those layoffs and the gutting of these agencies and all of that sort of thing. It's a sign of what's to come when one of the people in charge of all that also promoted the Cybertruck, which is notorious for having a lot of safety issues of its own. So the rationale for continued UK allegiance to the US, that their trade flows are balanced, or that such a deal is pragmatic, falls apart under moral scrutiny, and of course factual scrutiny as well. Even if one accepts the utilitarian argument, it is incoherent for a country to posture as a defender of international law or human rights while partnering so closely with a state openly flouting both. So, from the perspective of one of those demonic anarchists, this is a textbook example of state power serving elite interests. And it is rather interesting, as I've often noted, that the party of law and order, the Republican Party, actually goes on to sort of boost the critiques of power that are made by anarchist types. So rather than confronting the violence of borders, imperialism, and corporate domination, the UK government is reinforcing all of that. If there is to be a future based on justice, solidarity, and dignity, it begins by refusing complicity with certain policies. That means rejecting partnerships with governments that kidnap migrants and enable mass killings, which, in my opinion, the UK could have done. It also means building power from below, not through deals negotiated in silence between billionaires and heads of state, but through collective resistance to, all of these rotten policies that I've been talking about. So, with that out of the way, I've got another segment to the show that I call the Peripheral Poophead of the Week. And this one's going to be a little bit shorter. And once again, I'm going to be picking on somebody who is deceased. This time it is Robert Trump, uh, who is Trump's brother. Brother Robert Trump was involved in many Trump ventures. He joined the board of ZeniMax Media, the parent company of Bethesda Softworks. ZeniMax is known for publishing popular game series such as Fallout, The Elder Scrolls, Doom, and Wolfenstein. So, actually, some classic games there. So, Robert remained on the board and invested in the company until his death. His role gained attention after the Parkland school shooting, when President Trump linked video games to violence and met with industry leaders, including ZeniMax CEO Robert Altman. So, what is the scandal here? Why am I mentioning him? Well, for one thing, that was hypocritical that, Trump was claiming that video games were responsible for school shootings when actually his own brother, who was involved with Trump's business ventures to a great degree, was also involved in the video game industry. So, like, if the video game industry is responsible for, causing school shootings and whatnot, then he could point the finger at his own family, or at his own brother, at least, to a degree, right? So, yeah, it was hypocritical, which I've come to find is a very common thing in this political dynasty, which it actually is, and a strong reminder that Trump's family has had ties to government and media, even aside from Donald Trump becoming president. Trump's sister was actually involved in the courts as somebody who was appointed by Ronald Reagan himself. And in June 2020, Robert filed a lawsuit to block the publication of his niece Marielle Trump's book, Too Much and Never Enough, citing a 2001 confidentiality agreement. However, a judge ruled that the publisher was not bound by the agreement, and the book was released in July of 2020. So, that's another clear sign that uh, Trump's brother was, looking out for the interests of Donald Trump as a political candidate. So Robert Trump's life exemplifies the consolidation of wealth and influence within elite families. His roles in real estate and corporate boards really show the interconnectedness of business and political power. I almost said business. So, yikes. But I guess, that that was a little bit of a mistake, a blooper that maybe adds character to this episode. But anyway, the Trump family's ability to navigate legal challenges and have control over vast assets shows that the family has a lot of influence. They are the affluent individuals who have sway over public policy and discourse. It's almost like they're the deep state that we so often hear about. All right, so for the final segment, I'm going to talk about Fred Trump, who is, of course, father to Donald Trump. And this is because, I didn't focus enough on the specifics of the racist scandal that plagued Fred Trump. And this is the fetid fever dream flashback of the week, where I look at one of the interesting scandals that plagued a particular political figure. So Fred Trump, The biggest scandal involving him centers on housing discrimination in the 1960s and 1970s. In 1973, the U.S. Department of Justice sued Fred and Donald Trump's company, Trump Management, for racial discrimination in their rental practices. The DOJ alleged that black applicants were routinely denied leases while white applicants were favored. So what happened there? The DOJ lawsuit, which again was 1973, it suggests that the Trump company was accused of violating the Fair Housing Act by marking rental applications with a C for the word. Get ready for it. I'm going to say a word that you're not supposed to say anymore, but the C stood for the word colored, and they were steering black applicants away from properties, allegedly. And the Trump response, they countersued for $100 million. That apparently got dismissed, and of course they denied the allegations. And the outcome is that they eventually settled in 1975 without admitting wrongdoing, but they had to agree to proactive measures to ensure non-discrimination, which they were later accused of ignoring. So, this wasn't just a legal issue, it exposed a systemic practice of racist housing policies in private real estate firms. Fred Trump was never personally convicted of a crime, but the case highlights long-standing discriminatory practices that shaped urban inequality. So, from a critical lens, the scandal illustrates several key criticisms of hierarchical capitalism and state complicity therein. You have property as power. So those radical anarchist types would argue that private property, especially in the form of housing, concentrates power in the hands of landlords and capitalists. So Fred Trump controlled large swaths of housing, or swaths, I suppose that's how that's supposed to be pronounced. I've pronounced it both ways, to be honest, but swaths of housing, using that power to exclude people based on race. And this turns homes, which are a basic human need, into a tool of control. So you also have racism used as a structural tool. The discriminatory practices weren't isolated incidents, but part of broader racialized capitalism. Fred Trump benefited from federal housing subsidies while actively excluding black tenants, a contradiction that some see as proof that state intervention more often than not upholds privilege, not equity. You also have the state enforcement of injustice as a result of the conclusion of this case. So even though the DOJ sued the Trumps, the eventual outcome, a weak consent decree without real accountability, shows how the state often protects elites. So the wicked anarchist types would see this as the state performing the bare minimum to maintain the illusion of legitimacy and not justice. And, the inequality seems to be baked in. And it's in some ways, it might be getting worse now because of look who's in charge. The housing discrimination helped create racialized ghettos and suburbs over the years. And some would say this is not accidental, but inherent to a system built on extraction, exclusion, and profit, a system that Fred Trump manipulated masterfully. So think of it this way: if you have a hard time accessing a home, there's a reason for it. It's because, somebody is drawing profits from it. They're exploiting the situation that is going on. And, Fred Trump's scandal isn't just about a racist landlord. It's about a system that rewards exploitation, perpetuates inequality, and uses the law to maintain these unjust situations. So, all right, that about wraps it up for this episode. And I've made a few little verbal misfires here and there, but um, hopefully it provided you with some food for thought, and hopefully you don't wrongly or foolishly believe that the trade deal is anything that great. In fact, it's being used precisely to hide the more scary realities of what's going on right now. And just remember that trade normalization is supposed to be the normal order of the day. That's why they call it normalization. So there's no real victory here. The only sense in which there's a victory is that not everything has gone completely haywire, which I guess is a victory of sorts, but it's a very limited one. I guess there's a word for that. If I remember correctly, I think it's called a Pyrrhic victory. So anyway, have a good day.